The headquarters of Langston Tech stood like a cathedral of glass and cold ambition, its steel frame rising above the Manhattan skyline with the particular arrogance of a building that has been designed to make everyone who enters it feel slightly smaller than they actually are. From the outside, on a gray evening when the light was fading and the city was settling into its nighttime rhythms, it looked exactly like what it was, a monument to the kind of success that is measured in floors and square footage and the quality of the view from the top. Inside the 40th floor corner suite, behind a desk worth more than most families spend on a home in a decade, sat the woman who had built all of it. Selina Langston was known in the circles that tracked such things as formidable. That was the word people used most often, the one that appeared in profiles and the kind of conversations that happen at the edges of industry events when someone asks what she's really like. Formidable. It contained admiration and something else, something slightly harder to name. A recognition that she had arrived at her position through a combination of genuine brilliance and the particular determination that develops in people who have spent years being told they are not enough. She had been told that by people who should have known better, and she had responded by becoming impossible to ignore. She wore wealth like armor. She had built a fortress around her heart so gradually and so skillfully that she had almost forgotten the construction was deliberate. 5. The ice-cold demeanor was not cruelty, it was architecture. The kind you build when the alternative is exposure. Tonight, the armor was useless. The pain arrived without warning, the way the serious ones always do. A sudden sharp clutching in her chest, as if something had reached in and grabbed hold of the machinery and squeezed. Her breath caught like a needle scratching off a record, the sound of something interrupted mid-motion. She reached for her phone and her legs refused the instruction. That was the moment the fear arrived, real and cold and completely outside the range of anything her competence could address. She was on the floor before she fully understood that she was falling, the room tilting and the monitors above her desk casting their pale light in patterns that made no sense to her suddenly disoriented mind. In the doorway, a figure. A man in a faded gray janitor's uniform, holding a heavy mop, stopped in the entrance to the suite with the particular stillness of someone who has just walked into a situation and is assessing it with speed and accuracy. The light was behind him. She could not read his face. She knew only that she was on the ground, that her body had stopped cooperating, that she was more vulnerable than she had been at any point in the last decade, and that a stranger was standing in her doorway at an hour when the building should have been empty of everyone but people like him, people she had walked past for 14 months without once registering as fully present. Ew. The words came out of her before she could shape them into anything more composed. They came from somewhere beneath the CEO, beneath the fortress, from the part of her that had been there before all of the construction. Please don't hurt me. I can't walk. Oh, walk. His name was Elias Rowan. He was 35 years old, and he had been cleaning the marble floors of Langston Tech for 14 months, moving through the building on the night shift with the practiced invisibility that the job required and that the building's occupants enforced without ever discussing it. He was the kind of man whose tiredness doesn't show on the face. It lives behind the eyes in the particular quality of focus that belongs to people who are operating under sustained pressure and have made their peace with it. He had learned to be invisible in this building the same way he had learned most things, by paying close attention to what the environment required and providing it without complaint. But Elias Rowan was not, and had never been, simply what this building understood him to be. He had been an army medic. He had kept people alive in the dust and noise of Afghanistan in conditions that made the 40th floor of a glass building in Manhattan feel like a different universe entirely. He had made decisions under fire that most people would not be able to make at all, had maintained the focused, unhurried confidence of someone who understood that in a crisis, panic is a luxury that costs lives. He had been good at it, genuinely, demonstrably good at it, and he had walked away from a career that was moving in a very clear upward direction the day his daughter Emma was born 6 weeks early and needed him more than the service needed another soldier. Emma had a chronic respiratory condition. The surgery she needed was expensive in the way that American medical care is expensive. The kind of expense that doesn't respond to hard work or good intentions or any of the things people tell you will be sufficient. Elias had done the calculation and arrived at the night shift, which paid $2 more per hour than the day shift, and he had pushed his mop across marble floors in the quiet hours and saved what he could and continued to be present for his daughter in every way available to him. He had chosen the downward path as the world measured such things because Emma needed someone willing to bend, and he was more than willing to be that person. He had never spoken of this to anyone in the building. No one had asked. He took in the scene in the doorway with the speed and accuracy of his training. A woman on the floor, breathing compromised, lips beginning to lose their color, phone out of reach. He dropped the mop. The handle struck the marble with a sound like a gavel, and he was moving before the echo finished. He knelt beside her without hesitation. He did not see a billionaire. He did not see a name on a building, or a profile in a business publication, or a person who had passed him in the hallway for 14 months without a single glance in his direction. 4. He saw a human being who was scared and alone, and whose body was failing her in a moment when she had no one else. He had seen this before, in different landscapes under different skies, and the training did not leave you. It became part of the way you move through the world, a permanent recalibration of what matters and what you do about it. He checked her vitals with the focused efficiency of someone who has done this in conditions far less controlled than a carpeted executive suite. What he found was not a cardiac event in the classical sense, but something that in certain ways required just as much careful attention, a severe neurological response to extreme, sustained stress. The kind of thing that builds slowly and invisibly and then announces itself all at once when the system finally reaches its limit. She had been carrying this for months. He could see it in the way her body had been holding itself in the particular quality of the collapse. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said. His voice was low and steady, the specific register he had learned to use when speaking to someone whose nervous system needed to be talked down from an edge. He kept it rhythmic, unhurried, a voice that communicated calm not through the content of its words but through the quality of its delivery. A soft, wordless melody almost beneath hearing. The song that in his experience meant you are safe now, a signal not to the rational mind but to the body, to the part of the nervous system that responds to tone before it processes language. He had used it before in very different circumstances. It worked for the same reason it always worked, not because of magic, but because the human nervous system is ancient and recognizes safety when it is genuinely offered. Selena's breathing began to slow. The color, which had drained from her face with frightening speed, began its gradual return. Her eyes, which had been wide with a fear she had not felt since childhood, found his face and stayed there, and something in them shifted, from terror to something that was not yet trust but was the beginning of the path toward it. He stayed with her. He held the space as the training had taught him to call it. The particular quality of presence that is not intrusive but is absolutely unwavering, that says without words that you are not alone in this, and I am not going anywhere. When the building's security arrived, drawn by an alert, they moved toward him with the particular energy of people who have assessed a situation incorrectly and are acting on that assessment with confidence. He didn't argue. He simply said calmly that he was a former Army medic and that the woman on the floor needed him to stay until the paramedics arrived, and he said it in a tone that made the argument unnecessary. He stayed. The paramedics came. Medics came. Celine was taken out on a stretcher, and as she passed him, she said nothing. She was not in a condition to say anything, but she looked at him in a way that he recognized. He had been looked at that way before, in the dust of a different place, by people who had been on the floor and were now going to be okay. He went back to his mop. He finished his shift. He went home to Emma. 3 days later, Celine Langston returned to the 40th floor. She was different in ways that were difficult to specify, but immediately apparent to anyone who knew her. Something had shifted in the way she held herself, in the quality of her attention, as if the fortress were still standing but she had opened a window. She had spent 72 hours doing two things: recovering and reviewing the building's footage and Elias Rowan's personnel file with the same thoroughness she brought to any significant situation that required her full understanding. What she found was not what she expected to find, though perhaps if she had thought about it honestly, she would have admitted that she had not expected to find anything in particular because she had never thought to look. Elias's military record was the beginning of it. Decorated. Multiple commendations. A career trajectory that had been heading somewhere significant before he had chosen deliberately to redirect it towards something the Army would not have recognized as progress. She read about the early birth, the respiratory condition, the surgery that kept receding into the future as the costs held steady and the wages of a night janitor moved toward them at their own unhurried pace. And then there was the rest. Elias had been using his wages, meager wages, the wages of a man working nights for a $2 premium, to buy groceries for elderly neighbors in his building. Not occasionally, regularly, methodically, as part of the same quiet accounting that governed every other decision he made about money. He had been fixing broken heaters in the building without leaving his name, sourcing the parts himself, showing up in the early morning before his shift to do the work and disappearing before anyone thought to thank him. He had been paying what he could toward the medical expenses of families in his neighborhood whose situations were even more constrained than his own. He had been doing all of this in complete silence, not because he was performing modesty, but because it had genuinely not occurred to him that what he was doing was remarkable. He was simply responding to what was in front of him with what he had in the way that his nature and his training and his understanding of what mattered had taught him to respond. Celine sat with this information for a long time. She thought about the years she had spent building the fortress, the years of measuring people by what they owned and where they sat and how they dressed and which floor their office was on. The careful maintenance of a worldview in which her position at the top was both justified and necessary, in which the distance between herself and the people who cleaned her floors was a reflection of something real and meaningful about the difference between them. She thought about the man who had knelt beside her on her own floor and talked her nervous system back from an edge she had not even known she was standing on, who had hummed a melody in the quiet of her suite and refused to leave her side even when the security team told him to go. She thought about the 14 months during which he had moved through her building without a single person looking him in the eye. The lump that rose in her throat was not comfortable. It was the specific discomfort of understanding something true about yourself that you had been successfully avoiding, and it did not respond to the usual techniques for managing discomfort. She let it sit there. It seemed like the least she could do. What she offered Elias was not a promotion in the conventional sense, though it involved a title and a salary that reflected what he was actually worth. She launched the Overlooked Talent Program, a formal, structured process for identifying employees whose abilities had gone unrecognized because no one had thought to look past the surface to ask what someone was carrying beneath the uniform, to consider that the person pushing the mop might be the most qualified person in the building, to understand what it means to hold things together under pressure. Elias was appointed Chief Kindness Architect of the company's new foundation, a role built around exactly the capacity he had been exercising quietly and without recognition for his entire adult life, the ability to see what was broken and move toward it. The ability to stay in the silence with someone who was scared. The ability to fix things not because it would be noticed, but because they needed fixing. Emma's surgery was scheduled. It would be covered. This was stated simply as a fact, the way Elias himself stated things, without performance, without the suggestion that it was a gesture rather than a correction of something that should not have been wrong in the first place. The 40th floor office, which had been a museum of achievements, a careful curation of the evidence of Selena's success, became something different. It became a place where people came in and sat down and stayed for a while, where the conversation was sometimes about the foundation and sometimes about other things entirely, where Emma, on the days her father brought her in, would take up a corner of the whiteboard and draw horses with the focused concentration of a child who has learned to find joy in small spaces, and the drawing would stay on the board for days because no one wanted to erase it. Selene found that she had not lost anything by opening the window in the fortress. She had gained the only thing that the fortress had never been able to provide, the sense that she was living in a life rather than defending a position. The ice-cold demeanor which had been architecture gradually became unnecessary, not because the world had become less challenging, but because she had stopped needing the distance. Their connection became something sacred. Not romantic in the simple sense, but real, in a way that real things are when they have been built on honest ground, on the specific understanding that two people develop when they have seen each other in the moments that the usual performances cannot reach. He had seen her on the floor, terrified, asking not to be hurt. She had seen him in the full complexity of everything he was and had chosen to be. They had both been seen, perhaps for the first time in a long time, and the experience had changed the shape of things. True kindness does not require a title or a floor number or the right kind of shoes. It requires the willingness to drop the mop and kneel beside someone who is scared. It requires the willingness to hum in the dark and stay when the security team says go. It requires the understanding, bone deep and unshakable, that the most important thing in any room is not the person with the largest desk, but the person willing to be fully present for whoever needs them. Sometimes the people we walk past without seeing are the ones holding everything together. Sometimes the person the world has decided to make invisible is the only one who can save it. Sometimes it takes falling to the floor of everything you have built to understand that the building was never the point. The point was always the person willing to stay. You don't have to be the most important person in the room to do the most important thing in the room. You just have to stay. If this story reached something in you, please take a moment to like this video and share it with someone who needs to believe that goodness still exists in the spaces the world forgets to look. Subscribe to Pure Kindness and become part of a community that chooses to see the people who have been made invisible. We want to hear from you. Have you ever been helped by a silent hero when you felt you had nowhere left to turn? Share your story in the comments below because your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to read today. The person who saved you might not have had a title or a corner office. They might have been carrying a mop, and that is exactly the point. Thank you for being here, and thank you for staying.